People that don't have any industry experience are going to come and they're going to try to put a framework that doesn't actually help.
These numbers will get taken at face value.
Impact is not just company impact. How many lines of code did you change? We just need to be able to speak money directly into the thing that they understand.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Engineering Advice you've been waiting for and you've been missing. It's been long. It's been way too long. Welcome back. We are here with episode 1, and today we are talking about engineering metrics and productivity. My name is Keyur. I'm an engineering manager working in Canada. I've been doing engineering management for about 7 years now, and this is our 3rd season.
Hello, everybody. I'm Louis, a former senior director of engineering at a big company. I've worked at startups. Most recently, I became an entrepreneur. I'm placing small bets, but the good news is I'm still building a whole lot of software, so I still have an opinion on all this. Welcome to season 3.
Hey, my name is Vic. I am a former director of engineering at startups, and then I've since then been working just as I went back to being an IC. I'm currently a principal engineer at Twilio, and I also run a couple SaaS businesses on the side.
Hello, folks. My name is Thiago. I'm currently engineering director at Mube. Before that, I spent time in startups and also in other fintechs. And I'm also trying to do a few small bets here and there, mostly on the content side of career growth as an engineer and as a manager. All right, so let me kick us off today. Over the last couple of weeks, I think, the last month or so, there's a lot of controversy going on when it comes to the topic of measuring developer productivity. So I don't know if you all read, but McKinsey published this article where the title was actually really intriguing. Yes, you can measure developer productivity. It was meant to be polemic. It was meant to be controversial. Folks can get really passionate, really nitpicky about this, but is at the high level try to mix what they call the DORA metrics or the space metrics, right? They are the two main frameworks that companies have used to measure productivity, not at the individual level, but more at the organization level. But they also introduce a few new ideas, not new ideas, actually. They pull in some ideas that have been going on for a while, but they just put all in a single framework where they're trying to measure outcomes, optimization, and opportunities. And they have 3 levels. So they have outcomes, optimization, and opportunities. And then they have system level, team level, and individual level. And then they got some trouble when I think they have some really bad examples towards the end of their article regarding the idea of inner loop and outer loop. What I think is actually great. I love how they frame it. Inner loop is you're doing the TDD cycle. You're not getting stuck on deployment issues, tooling issues. And outer loop is the platform, things that in theory you should not be as a product development team, you shouldn't be spending a lot of your time. But I think they put some really bad examples when it comes to expectations for senior engineers or tech leads, where I think they had a really bad example on, they found on this company a tech lead or a senior engineer that was spending most of the time in meetings and helping people and not actually code. And they forgot that's the key for that kind of role. So I think they messed up on the levels of seniority and they tried to apply the same formula for different levels, what I think is completely bullshit. And I think the other thing is, on the article, they don't make super clear that impact is more important than output or effort, right? And it seems like people would be measured only on the metrics and not on the outcomes they are delivering, right? But if you actually read the article, remove, let's say, these few bad examples, the title, and stick to the core framework, I actually like how they put together a lot of ideas into something that can be arguably good to get something better than what we have seen in the industry over the last 10, 15 years, right? In my opinion, we have come up with all this that's really wishy-washy and don't really get to the heart of the problem. But I know it is a super polemic topic, engineering productivity measuring at the individual level. So then I think that triggered a super interesting discussion with Kent Beck and writing a article together, a 2-part article. And I think Kent is really on the other extreme on saying that is completely against measuring any kind of developer productivity. And they actually put together another framework that I had seen in many different articles, but I never seen together, that is basically the idea of what they call in effort, output, outcome, and I really love how they put together examples of sales, marketing, right? You can put things in bucket, how much effort you put, outcome, and then the impact at the end. And I think just to get to the end of it, there are people that like love it, their take, like Kantberg and Gerger's take, like criticizing McKinsey, but not proposing alternative. And there are people that are saying, yes, I agree with Kant and Gerger, but we need to do better. Because if we don't actually come up with something that is 80% there, people that don't have any industry experience are going to come and they're going to try to put a framework that doesn't actually help. It's going to be more damaging than doing nothing, right? So there are two sides of the arch. One is, let's just keep saying, no, we cannot measure, fuck that. The other is, maybe we should join the dark side and try to come up with something that can give some hints, but it doesn't mean that we're not going to look at impacts, right? And we also need to have different bars for different levels, right? And in general, everybody agrees that lines of code is bad, that measuring PR is also bad. But I think that's where the dilemma begins.
Thank you, Tiago. Maybe I can just take a step back and maybe define some of the terms that you mentioned. To start with, a lot of engineering problems are often complex and hard to define. There are a lot of unknowns because these are big, juicy, meaty, complex problems that haven't been solved before, right? So I think what McKinsey was trying to do was make that a pain point for execs that have no technical background or have no visibility or have no means to measure engineering productivity, saying it's big, it's hard, it's complex. Engineering teams are solving problems that have never been solved before. So you can't measure that because there is no precedent for that exact problem being solved because it's so complex, right? So Tiago mentioned DORA metrics. So just for folks listening or watching that don't know what that is. So I believe this was coined by Google and they had over 30,000 participants. This was mainly intended for DevOps teams or similar teams like research and assessment. And that's what DORA stands for, DevOps Research and Assessment Team. After interviewing all these professionals, after doing a lot of data analysis, they came up with the recommendation that one good, solid way to measure it is using the DORA metrics, which I'll explain in a second. And this is what helps differentiate low performers from elite performers, right? Or low performing teams from elite performing teams, what they call. And there were four main things that they got into there. First was the DF, which is deployment frequency, which refers to how quickly you can deploy software to production. So that's your deployment frequency. Second is your lead time for change, the LT. And this captures time between when a code is committed to when it gets to deployable state. For some companies that are really mature, it's immediate. For some companies, it could be days or even weeks or months because there's regulatory change, legal compliance, or what have you. And then mean time to recovery measures the time when there is an interruption in the deployment or there's a system failure. How quickly can you recover back to a working state? So that's the MTTR, mean time to recovery. And the last one they brought up was change failure rate, right? So this is how often does a team's change or hotfix for production fixes lead to failures after the code has been deployed. So again, this shouldn't be a common occurrence, but it does happen and does happen quite frequently. And this is a measure of that failure rate, right? So this is one metric, and McKinsey does bring this up as part of their framework, but they do go into a lot of other areas as well, which can't compare team for team, or what Tiago was talking about between senior engineers, junior engineers, principal engineers. Should all of their measurements be against the code base they're working with? Some of the things that are harder to measure are time not spent on the computer, like helping out a colleague with a problem, or if you are in person, walking over to a colleague's desk and peer programming with them or debugging with them. These items aren't necessarily measured with these metrics because, again, we can use this as one data point. Other than that, it shouldn't be the only metric to be measured against. I don't know if Vic or Louis, you wanted to go in and chime in with your thoughts as well.
It's hard to follow two like really good takes on this, right? So I think Thiago is right in that I really didn't consider the levels, right? Because this whole concept of inner loop and outer loop, if you have your junior engineer spending too many hours on meetings, as an example, which is an outer loop thing, that's a huge problem. And if you have your senior most ICs, your architects, as an example, spending too much time in the trenches writing code and not enough time at all dealing with the architecture of the system, looking 3 to 6 months ahead, then you have another huge problem because you're focusing too much on what's going on right now. So that being said, I will also say that the McKinsey report, I think, talks a little too much. I felt like in a few places it focused a little too much on like individual efforts, whereas I think that the developer productivity we're talking about really is like team productivity. Like if you're like, I do consider, and I do think that they made a lot of good points here that I don't actually disagree with. Like, you shouldn't seize on my agreement with, in general, the concept as me agreeing with everything. But I will say, if you are spending too much time, if your team is not able to deploy code fast, if you're not able to ship frequently, that is a failure of process that you do have to address. But it may not necessarily mean that your team is bad. And this is a thing that we find in startups, for example, right? That where like really small startups, you generalize across the company and you have a small team that's doing DevOps, that's managing the CI/CD and all builds and everything. And they're not going to be able to accelerate across all of these at the same time. And meanwhile, you find that at very large companies, you have massive dedicated build teams whose whole job is optimizing how fast can that build go out. Like my team pushes out, I don't know, dozens of times probably, but we also don't focus on anything other than the application layer. We can leave all those things to other things. So I think so not only does the report not focus on levels, it forgets to focus on the fact that these are often, they're talking about 3-4 different jobs. Now, of course, each of those teams are going to have their own metrics, right? I don't think it's bad to measure the performance of a team and measure whether or not they're meeting user expectations, whether or not they're hitting their own internal SLOs. Like the build team may have an objective of anyone that pushes a build should be able to push that out within 30 minutes. That may be their metric. It often isn't your team's metric unless your code is so terrible that the builds take so long, at which point, yeah, that's something you have to deal with. But I think these metrics are all broken across different teams, unless you're in a startup, of course, doing all 5 jobs and all of them are your metrics. But I think the larger your company gets, the more you specialize, these metrics become very focused toward what it is, who are your customers, what is your team's objective, why do you exist? And what that needs to be.
So Google came up with this, right? So I'm just looking at Google's measurement of this. They say that a team is elite if they could do multiple deploys per day. Their team is pretty high in this DORA method measurement or whatever, between once per week and once per month. This is logical, right? Like this makes sense, right? A team at the team level, absolutely, they should be able to deploy multiple times per day. I think the real challenge is, just speaking from experience, right? As an individual, there might be a month or two where you push no code because this is like, we've got some big project coming up. Everybody's in these meetings. Everybody's trying to figure out, plan it, get the design review out, get all these things. I'm not on elite. I'd be on the low or medium between once per month. And this is very bad, right? So this would be, if we're hitting the performance review, my scores would be very low as an individual. And I think that's really the challenge. And I think you touched on it, Vic, is that as a team, as a cohesive unit, should absolutely be doing well on all of these. The problem is we put that against the individual and now suddenly things break, right? Like we see this all over, even with the way the government does stuff, right? With the way it's great for the, the overall thing, but, some individuals, maybe very high performers that are actually very busy doing things, they look like crap.
I think like one difference on the DORA metrics and space metrics and what McKinsey was proposing is that I think DORA was initially intended to measure organizational performance. Was not even meant to be at the team level or at the individual level. It was like, oh, look at all these companies across the industry. What is their overall deployment frequency? And oh, let's compare, let's say, company A against company B. If we look at those things, they tend to show, okay, technology-wise, this company seems to be on a better shape, right? Because they're able to deploy more often, they're able to recover from. And on the other side, the space metrics, it's almost like a survey, which like some other, it's more almost the developer experience satisfaction metric. It's more, okay, if I ask the developers, and that can be at small scale, doesn't need to be the whole org, but it's more if I take different org inside the same company and look at the space metrics, that might give insight that some group is having more trouble, is being penalized by friction in some points than others. Space metric was more as a way to assess that group tooling and day to day. And I think what McKinsey is trying to do, and I think it was getting to the space that everybody was avoiding touching, that was like the developer at the individual level. And I think that probably their main mistake, and I'm looking at their article now, was they have, if you look at that matrix, right? Okay, you can measure system level, team level, individual level. And on the individual level, they look at the outcomes focus, right? Developer satisfaction and retention. Those are good metrics, right? How satisfied as an engineer. And then they look on the optimization level, how many interruptions a particular engineer is having. But then on the opportunities level, I think that's where they got into something called contribution. And that's basically, and I read from that, assessing contribution by individuals to achieve backlog, started from tools like backlog management like Jira, and normalizing the data to see like how much a particular individual is contributing towards the backlog. And I think the other one is called talent capability score. That one doesn't seem to be really at the individual level. It's more if you look at the mix of skills and abilities that a particular team has, is it good enough for what they need to do?
Sorry, I think talent capability score was mentioned at an individual level. That was one of the metrics for the team. As per the article, when they are deploying this, they are saying, yes, contribution analysis and talent capability score are opportunity
at the individual level.
At the individual level.
Yeah, you're right. You can be like, oh, this particular engineer doesn't have this skill set, right? So that's a problem, right? If they work on a team that needs to have this particular skill set, then they don't know that, but it's up to the individual level. I think the problem is that they didn't measure how this contribution analysis is done, or how this thing left at super vague is look at the contribution of a particular individual against the team backlog, right? And that can be inferred into number of PRs, line of code, whatever it is. But I think it can be more complex, and it can actually go. I think that's where there's a lot of controversy, right? And I think the title of the article does not represent the article itself, because a small part of the article is that section about the contribution analysis, and that was the thing that exploded, right?
Yeah, I think that does cause a lot of concern, because maybe for the four of us here, and maybe a lot of our audience as well, may understand the intricacies around what that means. But some execs or some leaders that don't have the background might just see these numbers that come from this contribution analysis tool. And to Vic's point, the contributions of a build team might be very different from the contributions of an application team versus a team that's purely maintaining infrastructure, right? Now, if you're looking only at their contributions in terms of number of lines of code or number of files touched or number of commits, that will vary very quickly and very differently. And my other fear is that when you're going for calibrations, which is assessing performance of all engineers across a higher level, or when you're going for promotion, these numbers will get taken at face value and say, oh, Vic has 200 contributions and Keyur has 5, not knowing that Keyur is working on a completely different area of the application than Vic is, and it's not a fair apples to apples comparison. So that's my fear of execs not understanding what numbers mean and using those numbers to say, okay, Vic deserves a double promotion next week, but Keyur needs 2 years to get there because Vic got an 85 and Keyur got an 18, right? That's the part that I fear the most is going to happen.
I like that hypothetical that you posed, but I'm going to pose an even simpler one because I think we've all been engineering managers at some point. So let's say hypothetically we have the same team, two individuals. Let's even make it simple. Let's say same level. One of them pushed out, I don't know, this is a silly example, right? Maybe a stupid example, but one of them pushed out a very low amount of code, a very low amount of commits. They touched very few files. The business value of what they put out was at the tune of millions of dollars. Now we have another individual on the team, crushed it in terms of activity. Nobody reviewed more pull requests. Nobody pushed out more code. Nobody has more code out there, but this other individual touched the project that made the millions and this other one did not. What would you do as individuals in this scenario now? Now you've got to forget about like being misunderstood across teams because they're working on different things. These guys are working on the same team, same thing. What do you do?
I love that example, Louis. And I think that's where I'm going to play a little devil's advocate here. Because I feel that, yes, I think that example is often used, and I agree. That how can you compare someone that has a precise level change on the code base and make a huge impact, a lot of analysis, right? Versus someone that's like changing config files and bumping versions and doesn't just following standards, replicating, copy and paste existing standards, right? And doing 100 circles to get something done. It's always gonna be tricky, right? But I think that's why I think like impact has to come first, but activity and output also matter at some level, but not only the code base level. Like, for example, this engineer that did one PR that was responsible for 1 million cost savings, right? Was he or she is lacking on during the whole 6 months, right? Or that's what I think we need to look at, like a more holistic approach, right? Because I often feel we miss that. Was this person helping others on Slack, right? Was this person like jumping in, mentoring engineers? Was this person talking to the PM? Activity at some level also matters, but it is not only activity at the code base level, it's at the team level. So if you look at all contributions like across like Slack, Jira, Zoom, if you actually take like a snapshot of what were different individuals doing, and you look at their impact first and what they're able to achieve, but next you look at the activity, and I would find completely surprising, and I'm still to be proven wrong with this, that I find a high performer engineer that has a lot of impact that has less activity than a low performer engineer. Is usually the opposite. The people with the highest impact also have the highest activity, usually. And I think we often use this example as an exception to the rule, but in reality, if I look at all high-performing engineers that I ever worked with or had reporting to me, they all had high activity rate. Not at the code base level, but if you look holistic.
So to start off, we're working with a hypothetical here, but Louis said something like, what would you do, right? But I think that question is incomplete. Why do you need to do anything? Unless the real question is, we need to let one go, or we need to accelerate this business to 5x whatever, and you have to replace one of these. That's when you're starting to think about which of these is the one that I need to keep and which is the one I need to let go. And obviously, you need to look at the impact first. It doesn't matter if someone changed 100,000 lines, but they had zero impact. That being said, I will say, look, I hate the idea of ever measuring lines of code someone wrote, but like Thiago said, when it comes down to it and you're looking at two people, it is extremely rare. I've actually never seen it that you have a low impact person who has written more lines of code and it turns out that, that they're pointless. No one goes around just changing node versions and updating configuration and not having as much impact, right? We are joking about it, but it really isn't true. Someone either is slacking off so much and doing no work, or they're doing way too much work, and you as a manager sit down there and you're telling them they need to go on vacation because they're going to burn out. This is often what we're comparing two people. One's a high performer, one's a low performer. That's what usually ends up happening. I will also say, impact is not just company impact. How many lines of code did you change that resulted in most amount of money? Impact is also, are you the one that avoids on-call? Are you taking on-call? Are you jumping onto issues? Are you mentoring? Are you fixing docs? Or are you trying to dump that on somebody else? There are people that, and this comes down eventually, if you're a manager and you have to pick two things, it's either so obvious And it comes down, it's effectively subjective. We're rarely sitting there going, oh man, I can't pick between these two. I'm going to have to start looking at their lines of code. It becomes so obvious that one person has a much larger impact on team culture. And you know that if you leave them there and you fire the other person, that it's going to have a detrimental impact on the team. Because you know it, everyone knows it, that one person is carrying the team so much. And going back to that point about what Thiago said, I've never seen it where the higher impact person writes less code. We're talking about coding roles here, right? Like it's entirely possible, but I say code because we said two people on the same level, so I imagine they have the same job. Now, if you're trying to compare a principal engineer to a staff engineer, you're trying to figure out who to let go. Now the difference becomes whose work at this stage of where the company is more important to you. Do you need architecture done or do you need code written? It may turn out that you want to keep that senior engineer and that staff plus engineer is of no use to you at this stage of the company. So yeah, it all comes down to why are you asking this question?
Yeah, that's a great point, Vic. And I know this is not commonly seen, and I know Thiago was alluding to the same fact, but I feel badly for those teams or developers that are given a task that they don't have control over. So let's say one team is tasked with rewriting a monolith and refactoring it into microservices. So this team is going to go very slow. They have 10 million lines of code to read through to understand. They have to come up with the design to break it into smaller microservices. And their first commit isn't going to be for 3 months. Now, if somebody is measuring activity, they are going to show up as low or non-existent for a long time before they start making these changes, right? As opposed to a team that gets assigned to an already existing microservice or one that's already been refactored into a new microservice. Now they have a newer technology stack to work with. They just have 10,000 lines of code to work with, which is a lot quicker to build, a lot quicker to understand. So they are going out the door at a much faster rate than the other schmucks that got tasked with refactoring them, right? Again, neither of these teams picked this project for themselves, but now there is a big discrepancy in how fast they're presumed to be going, regardless of level, right? Because the team could have junior or senior principals, but they're still facing the same problem. So that's when I think it becomes a little unfair. It's not common, you're right. Generally, it is a direct reflection of activity, but there are cases that are very real, do happen. And my fear is that they face the repercussions of such metrics.
I just want to say, if these are two different teams, right? This is no longer a fair comparison at all. And this is why we have managers, someone who is able to advocate for one or the other, to say they had it rough because their jobs are completely, and this is when calibration comes in, right? You calibrate these teams against each other. If your organization is one where you require every single employee to be calibrated against another, this is where that would come in, where you end up with these subjective weights and handicaps, golf term, to figure out just because this team ships so much less does not mean that they're the crappy team. They still performed a valuable role here and they're hindered by all these other people. And this is why you need a manager who's able to advocate for you.
Agreed 100%. As long as there is context provided and context taken during promotions, during calibration.
And all of this needs context. You have to have all this context, which is like a fear of mine of these stats being available of like lines of code that if you have a leaderboard of lines of code written up on a wall somewhere and your manager's out of town and your VP is looking to fire 10% of the company, are they going to wait around for your manager to come back and give them context on recalibrate, right? It's just a really weird situation you'll find yourself in. At that point, maybe you don't want to be there anymore if that's how you're going to be evaluated.
I think that's why I agree that you should look at impact and context first, and you cannot compare engineers from completely different code bases. You can actually compare engineers in different teams, like they're working on the same code base or they have the same shared constraints, right? But I think that the one thing that Vic mentioned, and I think that's the thing that a lot of that Kent Bag, Gergely, and other folks are fearing. And okay, if we start to measure using this contribution analysis or activity, then engineers and individuals are going to start to take the metrics, right? Like they can start to fake activity, right? Okay, you're going to measure PRs, you're going to do a lot of PRs. just to make more and more difficult to separate what's good and what's bad. And then I think their fear, and that's where I think a lot of people stand on that side, is that if we start to say this is a good way to measure developer productivity, it's that people are going to start to only do the things that count as productivity, right? And I actually have seen, to Vic's point, engineers that had a much higher activity rate but were still low performance. So I had engineers that were like, they would leave 20, 30 comments on every single PR. They would write a lot of code just following the same standards, and they had a lot of activity, but a lot of that was disruption, basically, right? And if you look at the leaderboard, whatever you use, their name would be at first. But if you are the manager, you would say, no, that person's a troll, right? No, because you would not even consider that, and everybody would agree, but you need the impact first, context next, and then you look at the activity, and that's, okay, now you can have some idea. But if you look at the activity in isolation, I think that's a big problem, right? But I think what is the biggest problem that McKinsey is trying to solve, and with that article, and I think Gergely and Kent mentioned that at the beginning of the article, that their hypothesis that is CFOs from different companies, they're asking the question, okay, we have this really expensive, like 2,000, 5,000 headcounts of engineering, and engineering is always asking for more, right? We need another 1,000 engineers. And those C-level executives are asking, are we sure that we have 1,000 productive engineers? And I think the problem that I have seen, and it's usually a management problem, not a productivity problem, is that managers don't give enough feedback and don't let people go soon enough. So a lot of people, they're often hanging, like a lot of companies that managers know they're not meeting the expectation of the levels. And then we are trying to solve a management problem, a bad management problem, with like a tooling, something that will tell the CFO more information than the manager had, while it is a performance management problem, right? But I had to see where that's coming.
It feels to me like this all stems from wanting some non-technical people that are super high up to be able to just quantify. And it's like when OpenAI went to Congress, right? Like they said, regulate us, please regulate us. The response is, we got to self-regulate, otherwise we're going to be regulated, right? So we need to find something that we can put out in front of these people, because we're asking for huge budgets. We have lots of headcount. We have all these things, and it's not that easy. I understand where it stems from, and I understand, but truthfully, this is very hard to measure, and so much of it is gut feel. Let me give you another example from my own experiences in teams, right? So I had two people, same team, okay? One of them, very slow, okay, but very thorough. They would take their time with stuff. They would try to do it right, and always the excuse was, I'm doing it right. But body of work, they were pumping out lots of things, just taking their sweet time, but pumping out lots of things. On paper, like if you looked at this individual's contributions, probably looked impressive because they were thorough. And then I had someone else on the team, total cowboy, right? Total cowboy in terms of contributions. Wouldn't ride all the time, but when he rode, the thing was just flying, right? And so if you needed something, if we needed to get this thing out, and that was the guy to jump on it. And if you mapped out their contributions, they wouldn't look anywhere near the same. But then when we map out their impacts, they're totally different, basically. Their impacts are not even. This one guy's impact is he's raising his hand and jumping into all these things and getting out projects that move the needle for the whole year, in comparison to somebody who did everything right by the book, that looks great. These are the things, right, that we have to, as managers, intuitively understand. Now, we can't evaluate those things the same way. On paper, this guy looks good, but he was very slow. Let's be real. We have this dial, right? We're not on a team where, engineers need to be self-aware about these things too. We have this dial, right? And we're not on a team where we're a startup that's moving fast. We can't try to have this super wonderful code base that makes no money. It's not going to work, right? And all of these things, how do you quantify these things? How do you measure these things? How do you reward these two individuals on the same team? And this is my trouble with this kind of thing, is that you put these metrics in front of somebody, they're going to reward the wrong guy. And so I think that's the problem. And so as a manager, you have to intuitively understand this.
I have had exactly the same situation with guys. It goes back to one thing that Vic said, that we will all depend on what stage of your company is. You might need more cowboys in the early stage and more I don't know, more say slow, but like towards the end, right? Like when you have like huge stake at risk. And I think there is other thing that like everything has observability. You fix things forward, you iterate. The biggest thing is to be fast, right? Systems are built in a way that is almost like impossible for you to break something by nature or break something big by nature, right? But that's why I feel that the slow but thorough engineer is great in some contexts, but the cowboy, let's say, might move the needle in a lot of others. It's hard to say, but I think if you look at their impact first, and you're saying, based on what you were saying, with the cowboy had a lot more impact, were working on things that were moving the needles, right? While the other was working on small things slowly. That's probably, and what is the moment of your company? That's probably the main thing that matters at the beginning, right? But I think it's hard. Yeah, it's pretty hard.
So we found two things already, right? Like two things that the universal metric wouldn't apply to is just, the stage of your company, individual teams. So like having a universal regulation is quite difficult on these teams.
It's complex, right? It's not black or white, and which is why I think engineering management, engineering leadership is critical to add the context here. Just two examples that come to mind that I've personally had to deal with. I had a gentleman on my team who was bipolar. So he had manic phases. And when he was in his manic phase, the guy worked 16 hours a day. He was like the top contributor. And this phase lasted like 2 months. And then when he got off his meds, or when he got into the depression phase, so think of a sine wave. So that's how his moods and his sickness went. When he was in depression, he couldn't get out of bed for 16 hours. So it was very hard for him to code and till he got back on his meds and self-regulated, right? So depending on who is looking at these metrics and looking at just maybe 2-month window, he's either off the charts and the single highest contributor on the team, or he's the lowest contributor on the team, right? So till there's somebody that's worked closely with him that can vouch for what's happening and giving him some leeway till he gets back to some rhythm of normal, that would be lost in translation, right? Another example I had was where there were one principal and one staff engineer, and their contribution in terms of sheer code contribution, I'm not talking about design and Confluence pages shared with other teams, but in terms of code contribution was very low. And when this was further dug into, it was found that they were basically wearing multiple hats they may or may not have wanted to. So they were doing requirements elicitation. They were playing the product hat and trying to figure out what the next feature should have in terms of requirement. They were developing a POC. They were doing testing. So now this one guy, because he was so capable, he was tasked with multiple responsibilities that he may or may not have wanted, and is taking away from his core competency because that's all he's forced to do. So there's a lot of nuances that come with this one universal metric that's used to measure everyone across the company. And that's the part I have a concern with.
Just to add yet another controversy to the thing, there is this really good article from Tony Riley, it's called the Gloom Work, I believe, that where she mentions the whole thing about engineers that are doing the glue work on their teams, meaning, let's say, organizing initiatives and like building docs and like doing a lot of the things that are needed but are not considered like really technical or really impactful directly, but more indirectly, right? It's not someone that's solving, let's say, conflicts, is trying to talk to different people. And often those people are getting penalized on calibrations and promotions because they don't have enough contributions to the code base or to the architecture, or they're not technical enough. And that's why I think management is such a tricky thing. And you're almost like a salesperson at the end, right? Trying to convince everybody. That's the context behind it. That's why that person actually was more important or had, let's say, more impactful contributions than others. But I think regarding this example you mentioned here about the engineer that had, let's say, a month of a lot of activity, then another month of depression, right? I think the questions here are going to come to what is the moment of the company, and can the company afford having someone that's unstable? One thing is that happens once, twice, right? And it is like a really unstable period of time for that person, right? He's on medical leave, whatever. But if you have someone that's consistently doing that, I think you will come back to Would you rather have someone is lower, but that we would be there 8 hours a day, doing things on a more continuous cadence, right? And maybe this variation of contributions is a problem because maybe you have deadlines and you cannot afford having someone that might not be in the mood for. And again, not saying that this is a one-off, someone that has a content, but if it is a pattern, that pattern of contribution should be, and you need to look what is the context, what kind of profile you need. And I think it's a tricky thing, and people might kill me for saying that, but I think it's true.
I think fundamentally, right, if not to get meta, but like fundamentally, we're trying to take these industrial revolution type things and apply them to a field that just doesn't work that way, right? Like fundamentally, our field doesn't work that way. If you have a hit product, if you happen to work on a hit feature, your contribution will be significantly larger than somebody that showed up every day, put in their 8 hours, the code was beautiful, all these things, right? It's just a different thing. And some of that is luck. Some of that is not luck. Some of that is intuition and skill. And if we even look at the way humanity has worked, again, not to get meta, but if we look at pre-industrial revolution, where you plant your stuff for one season and you reap the rewards another season, you're doing very different work as a human being in this world. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, we took that and we smoothed this thing out. And now we're trying to apply it to fields that have evolved post that, which have really, in my opinion, very little to do with that. It's not like bricklaying. Bill Gates, I think, talked about this. People figured this out very early in this industry's life. Bill Gates figured out very early that it's not like bricklaying. In bricklaying, one mason might be able to lay twice as many bricks. In our field, you could have somebody make 10 times, 100 times the contribution because of luck, because whatever, because they happen to be on a feature or a project. It depends on the phase of the project. It depends on the phase of the team. There's so many things at play, which make it so difficult for this kind of metric to be applied at the individual level. Fundamentally, that's the real reason why I disagree with it. And what happens is you have people that demand it because they want an easy way to manage. They want an easy way to figure this stuff out. And I know we touched on the fact that impact is the most important thing. But then what are we talking about? If impact's the most important thing, if it weighs 80%, then we're all arguing over this 20%, but that's really not what's going on, right? It's not what's going on. McKinsey and these guys want it to be 80%, okay? And they want impact to be 20, but it's just backwards. These companies are actually going to put themselves into bankruptcy over years from competitors that come in and move much quicker and build products that hit the mark and So I think it's very difficult to quantify these things, and it's not that easy. Again, even on teams that are not even, you could be DevOps, you could be all the way in the back end. You could build something that is 10 times faster, save the company millions of dollars, and that's huge impact. You might not look so good in these scorecards.
You use bricklaying, which I think is a good way to look at it. Like, it's taking a lot of assembly line metrics where you are in a much more closed system with fewer constraints and where you can measure people doing the same work and trying to apply that to a field where really different people have different jobs, because as a team, we all have different jobs, just slightly different. Like, you are supporting some team member, you're answering chats, you were up late last night because you got to be on call, and we're all going to just perform differently. That is not to say that we will not all be consistent in our performance over the long term. Like, you may have bad days, but when you start having bad months and bad years, that is when we start to worry about these things. But I think these metrics often really try to shoehorn people into the exact same roles, into the exact same things, when we're doing creative work. And we're doing work that is that someone could not have conceived of back in, since you said, Industrial Revolution times. We're working with abstract concepts of things that did not exist. And it's just different kind of work. And it's hard to measure everyone the same way. But like you said, they want to be able to apply these rigid rules so that they can say, those are your least productive, objectively the least productive 100 people that you need to get rid of or whatever. And in theory, if you brought all your managers together and you calibrate everyone to your company, you will be able to come up with that list. And it's not always a good thing to be able to come up with that list. If you have a bunch of high performers and you are insisting on your managers making this list anyway, you end up with something like stack ranking, which is terrible, where your managers are forced to kick people out of the company just because you have 10 high performers. Oh, but that's okay. That's too bad. You have to kick out 20% of them anyway. And then you go from objective metrics to subjective metrics. That person pushes back on arguments all the time, or they're not a team player, or they won't do X. And then you start to discriminate people based on just completely garbage, right? So it's hard. It's hard.
I think fundamentally we're all agreeing pretty much on a lot of things. We're agreeing that there is some relevance to these metrics. I'm not trying to run down these metrics completely. They do tend to correlate, but also fundamentally they break down at this level of someone is just years of experience, insight, intuition, and they build something that hits the mark, and suddenly the impact is very different. So they break down at that point. But so even though we agree, we still have this problem. So now the question that I want to pose to all of you is, what do we do about the CFO? It's the thing that Ken Beck got into trouble with, because yes, we agree this is shit, but what do we do about the CFO, right? They demand to know, because we have so many engineers that we want more headcount. And I understand that problem, right? And I empathize with the CFO's problem. What's the solution? So I throw that back now.
The one thing I was going to say, and I tried to answer that, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to, and I don't think it's a simple answer by any means. My biggest problem with the McKinsey was that they mentioned content, right? They mentioned like different patterns of contributions, but they didn't mention there are different contribution expectations for different seniority levels. There are people in the same seniority level that have different archetypes, right? And there are like people that have completely different patterns of behavior, right? Or leadership behaviors, and I think all those nuances are almost impossible to quantify, right? And on top of that, I think as Kay or Vic said, there are people that are working against completely different constraints, right? Like they work in different code bases with different technologies, right? And they work in completely different outer loops and inner loops, right? Do the tooling that their team is maintaining, those systems, right? And I think that's pretty hard to quantify overall. But I think like on the CFO question, I feel that like having some visibility of activity level across time and being able to put some data together as like additional data point with the whole context behind it might actually help to show like all the variations that come to play. And maybe like the most important thing is those metrics should be used as a discussion starter, right? But not as a decision-making metric. And I think it's really hard to do that because whenever you have the data, you're inclined to make imprecise decisions, right? And if you tie together, oh, this organization, this part of the organization is not doing well impact-wise, right? And I have these people that are not, let's say, not meeting the bar, not at the bar level that we expect in terms of activity, is super easy to say, I'm just going to cut from there, right? And that's what usually a lot of companies end up doing, even without the data this year, right? Like whenever companies did layoff, they would lay off people from areas of the company that were not performing well. And I feel that this data is ready come to play is more, do we keep saying that no data is better than any data? Or maybe there are some data that can be better than no data?
Or is no data better than bad data?
Yeah. Can we keep actually not having any data? It's going to tell a tool that will put some data out there. And if the industry is just saying we cannot measure it, there is no data that is good enough, we will get some data, right?
CFOs are going to go out and buy a solution off the shelf.
I think that's exactly what companies are doing already.
It's funny that there are no good solutions right now. There are a lot of smaller companies claiming that they have solutions and pretty dashboards, but when you actually start evaluating them, they don't do a good job of any meaningful metric. And I think this is part of the reason why even within this audience, we're going back and forth, because there is no easy way to articulate that. Again, if we are going down the rabbit hole of tool-driven metrics, are they really helping us, or are they posing a hindrance to us? What happens when these big cuts that Vic mentioned need to happen, where entire units or entire teams or big chunks of engineers need to be laid off? Sometimes their managers, sometimes the directors, sometimes even the VPs don't know that, because they want to keep this on the down low. They don't want the other teams or team members to know, to avoid panic. So somebody high up there in the hierarchy looks at some sort of metrics and makes a decision. on who is going to be let go. In that case, the manager or the director or the VP may not have a chance to provide that additional context, right? Because just because it's thousands of people being let go at once, they don't have time to gather context on each person. So they just sort by least impact, and however impact, and I say that in quotes, whether that's files touched in their code base, whether it's number of commits, whether it is number of JIRAs closed or the story points completed. Somebody sorts by that number, and whoever shows up at the bottom, oh, too bad, you're off. And that's the part we need to be careful about to make sure that we don't overcorrect and solely rely on tools and the numbers that they produce. So maybe we should do a quick closing round. So if you were to produce an ideal dashboard that could help execs, the CFOs, or technical or non-technical folks alike, what are some metrics that you would surface up that could be shared at the board level or at the C level?
I think basically many of us come up in this field as engineers. We become managers. We don't really have the adequate training to make our case to these CFOs and things like that. Basically, there is a solution to this, and that solution, we do have data, and that data is impact. We just need to be able to speak money, right? We just need to be able to translate the stuff that's been built directly into the thing that they understand. I have 5 engineers, my team made X, my team saved X amount of time, X amount of things, and that's it, right? Like, we need to be able to sell that. We need to become better at making noise. So I think the real solution to this is just training us engineering managers, training individual engineers to communicate their impact better, right? Being able to, so if I had a dashboard, it would be millions of dollars made per engineer. Like Valve does this every once in a while. We've got 500 employees and we're generating billions. That's 100 million per engineer. Great. We've got an awesome team. I dare you to try to fire somebody. I think it wouldn't happen. But I think the point is, like, we need to be able to get to that. And here's the thing. Here's the other thing. The kicker to this is that too many of us don't value that. And so those numbers don't actually look that good for a lot of teams. And that's the real fundamental issue. That's the root cause of this whole thing. So if we were actually in a situation where a lot of these teams are, in fact, impacting those numbers, then no one would care to measure lines of code. If you could tell the CFO in dollars, in time saved, in people, or whatever it is, whatever the metrics that your team deals with, if you could quantify that, and it's not easy to quantify it, but over the aggregate as a team level, you as a manager need to have that ability to assign it to the individuals on the team and then communicate that. And you need to train those individuals to do that as well. And I think that's the key, basically, is we need to quantify the impact. And if we could do that well in a dashboard, then all this other stuff would just, no one's going to force us to have lines of code. They don't force the accountant to tell them how many cells in a spreadsheet they touch. They don't care. The accountant can speak money.
I think that the problem that I see is that it's really hard to quantify impact at the individual, because usually, and I think it's at the team level, yes, but at the individual level, it's really hard because usually you have someone that helped someone, right? And I don't know if that's scalable, right? But I love that. And the thing that I would propose, I think it would be like, start with the impact, especially for the top contributors, and try to quantify the impact as much as you can. But I would say, like, for maybe like junior engineers, low performer engineers, actually have some dashboard where you're able to see their activity on the day-to-day might be a good data point. Might be another good data point. If you're not able to quantify impact at that individual level, see their activity rate across, and not only at the code base, but across Slack, number of, contributions on the documentation side, calls, right? Like all those things where they were there, they had some activity, right? I think that would give another data point that kind of, it could be a decision factor, at least to help to quantify like contributions, right? I think contributions like at the code base, at the documentation level, at the chi level, org level, can be proxied by activity, right? But I would love to avoid that by all means and efforts. If we could do impact at the individual level, but I think it's pretty hard because you usually have a lot of people help each other, right? And I think that's the point that Gary mentions on the article, that is almost impossible to quantify. We save $1 million. This individual alone did that. Did he? Or was the staff engineer there helping? Was like someone that help him to change the direction, who actually did the work, right? And he's really hyped, what is it? But we can go on and on. I guess I don't have a great suggestion.
This is hard. I don't like the idea of there being public leaderboards of comparing someone's metrics to someone else's metrics because, as I said before, you just lose context, right? I think what is helpful that helps the individual is, first of all, showing them how to build brag sheets where they're able to, and this achieves two things. One, it helps you to talk about your work and what impact you're having. And you are going to know best what impact you're having. It's hard for me and this is going to be really helpful during your promotion conversation, but it's also going to be helpful during the year for you to have a public brag sheet. It'll be good for you to look at the brag sheet of your colleagues and seeing, oh, they're mentoring such and such. I should probably start doing that too, so that I can say, I want to avoid a situation where people are competing with each other, but ultimately we're all competing for a job. So I feel like brag sheets are one of those things that help you do this. Things like how many tickets you've picked up and closed are pretty public info, really. There's no one's hiding that. And that's something you can go look at. But what I always fear with these things is that you should measure things that you measure the wrong things. You incentivize people to do the wrong things. If you start giving too much weight to number of Jira tickets closed, people are going to create tiny tasks to close. People are not bad normally, but if you're going to give them poor incentives, if you're going to give them an incentive to game the system because that is how you've chosen to measure them, people can justify doing anything. And that's going to be creating a lot of tiny tickets they can close simply so that they can be on par with their colleagues. It's just hard. I feel like the best thing you can do really is help people be able to brag about themselves and be a really good advocate for them if and when it comes time to fighting for a promotion or you need to figure out who to let go. Ultimately, everyone is not the same. Some people just are really good performers, but there's space in your organization for everybody. There's space in your organization for the senior engineer who just does only the thing they need to do and no more. And there's place in your organization for this person that goes all in all the time as a cowboy coder who has the greatest impact, but it's also constantly breaking prod. That there's space in your organization for both people.
That's great insight. You want to be measuring the outcomes of both individuals and teams, not just the activity, right? Because there could be a flurry of activity and no meaningful outcome. And to Vic's point, I think it was Peter Drucker that said, what gets measured gets managed, even when it's pointless to measure and pointless to manage it, right? Even if it harms the team, even if it harms the organization, if you measure it, if you incentivize measuring it, it will get managed in good ways or bad ways, right? So assuming positive intent, nobody wants to work this way, but if you prioritize Jira tickets, you will get 10 tickets just for documentation. You will get 10 tickets for testing. You will get 10 tickets for coding. One Jira ticket now became 30 because that's what you're incentivizing, right?
Suddenly everyone is so productive.
Yeah, productivity goes through the roof. Quarter over quarter, the number rises and rises. I think just in this podcast alone, we've gone over the complexities of coming up with meaningful metrics and the challenges with doing them at scale, right? And making sure you take the context into consideration, making sure you take the different archetypes, the different levels. So if you're looking for a side hustle, if you're looking into digging into the AI space, this is your next $1 million idea right here, to develop a public tool, a public dashboard that everyone can use that takes into account everything that we touched in here tonight. On this happy note, I will say goodbye. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next week.